Hello, everybody. Welcome to International Podcast Day 2020. I am the co-founder of International Podcast Day, Dave Lee. And thank you all so much for joining in to the international celebration of the power of podcast. I am really excited this broadcast to bring you three fantastic ladies in the podcasting space, Paroma, Anisa, and Saya. How are you three doing today?
We're good. Thank you.
Very good.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we are really excited about your broadcast and presentation. We're going to be talking about podcasting in a fandom, the journey from fan to creator. And this will be a first. We have never had a broadcast and presentation about this. This is really exciting times. But first, I did want to thank our sponsors for International Podcast Day. You can see them over at internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. We have our amazing platinum sponsor, Blueberry. They have a promo code over there for a free 30-day trial. You can also check out our gold sponsors, which is Focusrite and Podiant, another podcast hosting company. Again, head over to internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. Find the promo codes, check them out. Without their support, and of course, without the support of our 60 podcasters from 26 different countries for this international event, none of this would be possible. So I want to get out of the way. I don't want to take up any more of the time from these three podcasters. And ladies, I will turn it over to you. And thank you so much for being part of the International Podcast Day community.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
Okay. Here we are.
Hi, guys. So very quickly, we'll just introduce ourselves, and then we'll explain what our fandom is, and then we'll get right on it. So, hi, I'm Paroma.
You're going in regular order.
Oh, that's true. Sorry. That's not our usual. Like when we start our podcast, that's not the order we start in. So let's do this right.
Hi, I'm Saya.
I'm Anisa.
And I'm Paroma. And you're not listening to an episode of Dramas Over Flowers. So that's the name of our podcast, and our fandom, where we went from like fans to creators, is around Korean dramas. And as you can see, none of us are Koreans, but if you are, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you must already know the Korean dramas are becoming really popular internationally. And this has been happening for a couple of years now, especially with Netflix taking it everywhere. Mm-hmm. But we became fans much before that.
Yeah.
Guys?
So let's so let's
talk about our personal entry into this fandom. I started watching Korean dramas in 2009. And at that time, I was like into anime and like Japanese dramas. And so it was kind of this lateral sort of transfer over where I discovered this thing that was sort of available on the same old like janky streaming sites where I used to watch my Japanese dramas. And I just sort of fell into it and I never looked back. How about you, Saya?
Similar sideways move from, anime and just generally growing up on subtitled TV. So it wasn't difficult to then make the leap. And so for me, it was 2012. And I think the first drama I watched, it was so unlike anything I'd ever watched before. I ended up watching it back to back 3 times. And then Paroma happened.
Yeah, and Sarah kind of dragged me into Korean dramas, kicking and screaming. She kept at it for like 7 months. She was like, I found this amazing thing. You need to watch. And before that, we basically bonded over books. So in Saya's opinion, this was a great transition from books to TV. She was like, this is basically books, but on TV. You would love it. And she was right. I did. It just took a while for me to get around to watching stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the things that characterizes Kdrama the most is that they have an emotional through line, which is it's quite unlike Western TV in that sense. A lot of emotion going on, and that gives us a lot to talk about.
It does. It lends itself to dissection really, really well. And it's not just like theories and speculations about what's going to happen, which is what usually happens in other, let's say, the Marvel fandom. It's more, thematic. What do you think the motive was? What was the emotion here? What, kind of cultural or socio-political events might have influenced this? You can talk about a lot of really deep stuff, and all of us tend to go really deep, maybe deeper than necessary with our dissection. But
yeah, I feel like we maybe don't need to explain exactly what fandom is because everyone has some experience with fandom.
Yeah,
but perhaps we should anyway, and I feel like Anisa is probably the best place to give us that, being the most veteran among us.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, no, I mean, we all know what fandom is. I think some of the unique aspects of the K-drama fandom is that it tends to be very female dominated. And so especially for women, it's a much sort of friendlier, safer space than a lot of other fandoms that are not necessarily welcoming to women, and often are not welcoming to women, are not welcoming to people of color. And the thing that I think one of the things that attracted all of us, or at least me, I can speak for myself, and I think I can speak for my co-hosts, we have a hive mind at this point, is that it was a totally not like a totally people of color space. And we didn't really have to deal with a lot of the sort of racist stereotypes that we had kind of grown up with in a lot of Western TV. That doesn't mean that K-drama is free of problems, but it is a space in which we felt very welcome and very, and in general, the fans are just really wonderful and very easy to get to know, and they form bonds really quickly. And I'm wondering if it's some of the characteristics that Saya said about how it's like an emotional journey, and people get really into it, and they really like analyze things and discuss things, and so maybe that's what it is. And it's incredibly global. So that's something that you can see even among us. Like, we live on 3 different continents. We're all in very different time zones right now. Some of us had to get up really early or stay up late. However, like, because we are all in the English language speaking fandom, there's definitely still this sort of narrative of whiteness and the presence of whiteness that we still have to kind of navigate. And so we did. That is one of the reasons why we started our own podcast, which we will talk about a little later. So that's my sort of nerdy overview. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, exactly. It's Korean drama fandom is probably one of the least toxic fandoms I've been part of, and it's just it was welcoming, and also it's not like we don't have flame wars, but one of the but yeah, like way less. And also so the way we started to get into making our opinions heard as more than just fans was that's something that's really interesting to me, was by writing these long posts for one of the I think it was one of the biggest English-speaking review websites of the time. So all 3 of us were writers there, drama beans, and it was reviewing and recapping Korean dramas for the international audience. And
for the international
Anisa,
English-speaking audience.
English-speaking audience.
Yeah.
Which made a big
absolutely.
difference.
And it was founded by Korean Americans, and it was a very friendly space for the audiences to come and discuss long form, just ideas. And so that's where we met. That's where our writing predominantly started. But then at some point, while we were doing all of this stuff, we started thinking that, hey, we are doing this for others, as in, like, we are writing this, we have a lot of freedom, and however it's not our space. Like, there are certain limitations when you're writing in other spaces. It's not like we were ever told you can't write about this. This is a mental restriction that you tend to start having. You start assuming that there are limitations. So we really wanted not to worry about that, and we started wondering how we can start creating for ourselves. So that's something that we want to quickly get into in this live stream.
you want to go next, Saya?
Okay. So what we kind of want to take a little look at is like why and how did we make the leap from being ordinary members of the fandom to being people who worked in it and created stuff. And that, as Paroma said, the first form that took was writing. And I think that's actually a really important stage, and I don't want to jump over it and go straight into podcasting, although we obviously will get to the podcasting very quickly. But what Paroma mentioned about whether we can give ourselves permission to participate as a louder voice or with somehow authoritative or more authoritative than an ordinary member of the fandom. I feel like the writing experience that we got from Drama Beans, where we were all writers, is that in that space we learned how to participate as people with a platform, right? Because before that, you were just
Leaving
you didn't
comments.
feel like you didn't feel like you had a responsibility to get things right in a particular way. Whereas once you started being this person with the megaphone, then you start thinking about issues like, am I allowed to comment on like Korean culture as a non-insider? And one of the sort of moments of encouragement or prolonged period of encouragement that you had was that people who were sort of insiders to that told us, you know what, it is okay. You're mindful of this, so that's going to make you more, careful. It's going to make you do your research, and because you do that, you are then less likely to sort of what is it do like commit various racist faux pas which you never want to do. And
Yeah.
also at the same time, it makes you more you're allowed to be a little bit more critical. But there is a choice between whether you are commenting purely on the story or whether you're commenting on the culture. And one of the things that we had to sort of figure out by ourselves as we were doing this is, what are there any inherent problems to being an outsider when commenting on this? And I feel like at the time that we entered, for me, it was just a year after like discovering Kdramas. I became a writer about Kdramas. So it was at that point where I didn't know a lot of stuff, and I was still really worried about making mistakes. And so when we talk about, or we haven't talked about, but we were discussing this beforehand about whether K-drama fandom has gatekeepers. And I would say no, but you can, and part of that is because the K-drama audience is so globalized now. What does fandom really have gatekeepers? Interesting question. But back then, there was a lot less. The audience was much smaller, so it felt like you had a louder voice in a smaller pool, right? Even as just a fan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that because we are all of like marginalized identities in different ways, we do tend to be very careful not to, fetishize Korean culture or to, claim things that are, like don't belong to us. I do think that we are very careful. And one of the things that allowed us to sort of write freely and be comfortable in the beginning is that we always wrote under pseudonyms. When we were writing for Drama Beans, we used pseudonyms. And as we sort of started the podcast and then we started, now we're doing live streams, you can see our faces, so that's something that we were ready to do right away. Like in the beginning, when we started the podcast, all of us were still using our pseudonyms. And then after we started publishing it for a while, Paroma and I decided to connect it to our real identities because it was something that we wanted to connect to our real life and that, sort of the work that we were doing in our real lives. But that's also made us able to bring our backgrounds and kind of our positionality in the relation to what we're talking about, and bring our own cultural perspectives to the experience of watching. And that's, I think, enriched our conversations, because we're not solely just looking at the story and the characters and what's happening on screen, but we're also bringing our real world context in a way that I think people connect with, and then for our listeners or our readers, they also start sharing some of their own cultural perspective, which has been one of the really amazing things that we've experienced as we've connected with more people who are reading our work and listening to our work. It's been really, really rewarding.
Yeah. Going back to a minute to when we were writing for Drama Begins, one of the things that I really appreciated about that experience was that it forced me to look deeper into this culture that I was, dissecting stories from. Because before that, it was just I was learning all about the culture through the dramas, and that can be stylized, right? Like if I'm learning about Americans just through American TV series, I'm gonna get a skewed idea.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I did for the longest time till I made friends with Americans. I'm like, they are actual people. So,
Are they?
Yes, hi.
And the same with like British television. And so once I started becoming friends with Saya, I'm like, oh, okay, right. So, people. The thing with writing about Korean dramas is that you're writing and reviewing these shows, and you're not just like summarizing the plot. You're trying to explain to readers something about the culture, so you have to know a bit about it as well. So that forced me to start reading news clippings about what's going on in South Korea. I started just becoming more politically and socially aware of that part of the country. Both Saya and Anisa learned the language. I've been struggling with this for like 8 years now. I start and then I stop, but both Saya and Anisa took classes and stuff. Anisa did her entire thesis. Like she just finished uni, and Anisa can tell you about that. But these two, they really went deep into learning about the culture. So when we say that we went from fans to creators, there was a lot informing that journey, even when we hadn't created anything at all. We became very invested in making sure that what we knew, that we actually had something to say about the culture. It's not just that, hey, this drama was great, 4 or 5 stars. That for us, for the three of us, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That's super entertaining. I watch lots of channels and read lots of blogs that do that. But we couldn't have done it convincingly or well. All three of us tend to be super talkative, long form writers. So, of course, what we created was always going to require us to know our material well. And again, when it comes to actually knowing stuff, Anisa and Saya know way more about Korean culture, about especially the political. Anisa knows way more about the history.
Anisa's our professor.
I did. She's our professor.
I did
Absolutely.
write about Korean dramas in my master's thesis. I did, yes.
She did.
I did.
And a couple of months ago.
Well, you know what's really fun? Sorry,
Yeah.
just cutting there. What's
No, go
really
on.
fun is that, like, I've attended panels and talks by other academics who are in the field of various Korean pop culture related things. And while I listen to them, I'm like, this is very elementary level, and that's a PhD. And you're like, oh, does that mean that we technically have PhD level, surpassed PhD level knowledge in K-drama? So, I feel like at times we could give ourselves honorary K-drama PhDs.
The thing is that you didn't write a dissertation.
But I'm sure our body of work would count, right?
Yeah.
Is there a University of K-drama somewhere?
Exactly. You don't need a committee to validate your experience.
But I mean, this is the thing about fandom as well, is that, and I really like the term that one of our one of the friends of our podcast used, which is fan scholar. like, I think the scholarship in the fandom can often be really underestimated. And there is a great deal of scholarship. Don't underestimate the nerds. They really, like Paroma says, really get in there.
Yes.
Yeah, and that at the end of the day is kind of what forced us to create our own space. Also, harking back to the gatekeeping thing which I mentioned, I don't think Korean dramas has gatekeeping. It's one of the most welcoming fandoms in that way. They don't see your gender. Of course, they don't.
We
I
just assume
wouldn't
everyone's
want to
female until
generalize.
proven otherwise.
Kind of. Actually, that's true. We are always a little shocked when it turns out that one of the drama fans
A
that
man?
we've been
What
chatting
a
to
rare
turns out to be a
specimen.
guy. I'm sorry, that probably doesn't sound great, but it's not that you discriminate. Nobody tries to find out your gender. Nobody tries to find out which country you're from or any of those things. It doesn't even matter if it comes out. What is relevant is how do you love what you're watching. Can you explain your thoughts and feelings about it? Those are the things that people tend to worry about. So gatekeepers in the fandom, no, not so much. But here's the thing. As I said, once we started writing for Drama Beans, once we started having more of a voice in the fandom, certain things started happening. We have never had very negative experiences. I personally have never had very negative experiences. Saya actually has had a little bit. But mostly, we never had a situation where anybody stood up and said, hey, you don't belong here. Your opinion doesn't belong here. But as we started having more of a voice, of course, our own personal, like our cultural experiences started influencing what we had to say. And that inevitably did make some people a little uncomfortable because there was just too much person of color perspective in what we were saying.
Yeah, I mean,
And
sorry, finish your thought.
no, go on.
There's definitely this string that, even though we've said the K-drama fandom is the least toxic, for me, it's the least toxic fandom I've ever been in. But there is still that sort of thread or that discourse that I think exists in all fandoms, where like once you start calling out things about the media or the cultural product that's problematic, some people will just be like, oh, like let's just let us enjoy this thing. Why are you getting political? Or like, it's just a show, or like you don't understand their culture, like you're just trying to create problems, or you're too sensitive, like these kind of things. I mean, we've all seen this, right? That is definitely a thing that happens.
My favorite comment, and thankfully this has not been something that I've faced directly related to the podcast, but elsewhere in the fandom, my favorite comment is that let's say something happened in the industry or in a particular drama and we critiqued it, and then somebody, and I'm from India, Anisa's from the US and Saya's from the UK. I don't think we made that clear, but so we
I think our
make a
accents
comment
did the work.
critiquing. Well, yes. Well, we make the comment, and then somebody comes and says, well, don't bring in your American political views here. And I'm not American, so that always just takes me aback a bit. Like, if you're...
Also,
Everything is American. It's all American, don't you know?
Also, there's a slight... I'm not sure if the word tension is the word, but maybe a little friction in the fact that though we are not Korean, we are still Asian. Like whether we're Indian or American or British or whatever it is, we are all Asian. And we do have, like, there's a lot of, I mean, Asian cultures have a lot more in common with each other than they do with Western cultures, right? So there's a certain part of that where it does feel like it's actually, as an Asian, we're insiders, even if we're not Korean. So there's, and that does create an interesting tension in the fandom because, because there's a lot of differentiation, right? People, yeah. Sorry, go on, Anisa.
No, I think there is this certain. There have been a lot of conversations at certain times about certain plot points or certain, types of stories where some Western viewers will be like, well, this doesn't make sense. Why is this character putting up with this? And it's like such an Asian kind of conflict. And then you're like, well, maybe I wouldn't react like this in this situation, but I definitely get it. You kind of get the cultural context, you get what's happening there, and there tends to sometimes be this sort of blanket, like, that's dumb, but it's coming from a place of just not understanding sort of that. I mean, I hesitate to blanketly call things Asian culture because, like, what is Asian culture? It's such a broad continent. And there's so many differences
Which
and
is kind of my
complexities.
point.
Yeah, but there are definitely overlaps and things that we have, that we kind of have in common, like, colonization, things like that. So, like minor things like that. So it does.
Familial hierarchy, for instance.
Yeah.
There are things that it's just ingrained in us when we were growing up, and we question it. Of course we do, but we also understand where it comes from. So in terms of gatekeeping, again, it's often a case of some people looking at Korean dramas as a fandom where they come for escapism. And if you bring in too much analytical, nonsense into it, they get really offended. They just want you to back off, and they want to protect their space. They don't want you to come and like bring in your anti-racism agenda in here. What?
Yeah.
So
how can it be racist? It's Asian.
Yeah, like if you're all Asian, can you still be racist? So there's this entire thing. So there is
Spoiler,
no gatekeeping, but
spoiler answer is yes.
yes. But there are, of course, as in every fandom, there are certain sections that feel really strongly about protecting the fandom for themselves and their own group. And it's always asking you to not bring in any kind of, socio-political nuance into the conversation. Just
And
do it.
the great thing about fandom in that respect is that fandom kind of has room for us all. If one place isn't home to you, you can go and make another space. It's a vast and empty land. There's the space. You can keep on expanding it. It can keep on growing. And I think that's what happened for us, which was great. There's one thing I just wanted to skip back to when Anisa was talking about pseudonyms and stuff. And I remember, I still do use one in case that wasn't clear. And part of that is tied into like my identity as a K-drama commentator was built around this name. So I feel like if I change it now, I would be losing all of that. Plus, when you start off, as a writer, you give people your words. We moved on to podcasting and we gave them our voices. And now we've moved on to live streaming and you can see our faces. So I feel like we've we've shown a lot of that identity. And what's in a name? It's that name that you use. It has its own history, right? Even if it's a pseudonym. And there are people we know in the fandom whose real names, we've known of them for like nearly a decade and we still don't know their real names. But hear their fandom name and you're like, you know exactly who that is. You know all of their street cred. You know everything about the work that they've done in that space. And one of the other things that I remembered as we were discussing this subject just before we came on, is that when I started as a writer at Grandins, and I started a little bit earlier than you guys, at that time the commentary was largely limited to and dominated by Koreans of various origin, like Korean Americans or Koreans, or they were Korean, right? So it was a concern when we started, we were the first batch of non-Korean recruits almost. Not the exact first, but very close to being the first. So it was an issue.
I was definitely the first Indian.
Yeah. And I think I was probably the first Brit as well. So there was definitely that question that I and my colleagues, my also non-Korean colleagues at the time, like 2 or 3 other writers, it was something that we talked about amongst ourselves, is, whether our credibility as commentators would be questioned if people knew we weren't Korean. And at that time, what my my seniors told me then was that they were careful about making identifying remarks things that would show categorically that they were not Korean. So they were careful not to say things like that. And so I spent a lot, like most of my early writing career at Drama Queens, being quite, carefully ambiguous. But while I was a fan, I'd never been that reticent. And once we'd moved on to podcasting, I think the two of you using your real identities, it made it feel weird for me not to also be able to share those parts of my identity, which a lot of which we have in common. And in a way, that was very freeing. But we were able to do that because we had that safe space that we created between ourselves.
Yeah. We kind of skipped over the question of, are we allowed to be ourselves when we are writing for someone else? And we're like, we'll just make our own. We don't have to ask anyone if it's okay to be us. And so we just did that. To go back quickly to the username thing, when I entered the fandom, I was just using this Festa as my username to comment in spaces, because that's the general norm in fandom, to have a username. And also because you expect that your name might be taken up by somebody else. So it's just, quirkier to have a username. It's not so much because I prized anonymity. It didn't occur to me that that was something that I needed to focus on. Once I started writing, I was given an option to choose a name, and everybody around me was using a username. So I did that as well. Again, not something because I thought I needed to protect my privacy behind a username. It was just the fandom norm. And there is also an amount of independence that you get, especially when you're a newbie in a fandom and nobody knows you, an unknown quantity. When you have a username, people can make assumptions based on your name. It can give away your ethnicity, your nationality, and you can't help it. In real world, people do make assumptions. So you're just freed up from that when you're first entering the fandom. Over time, as people get to know you through your username, and in our cases, through our words, what we used to write, it gave us credibility as individuals and not just as people who were, occasionally commenting on stuff. And over the years that we've been doing this, moving on to podcasting, starting to use our own name, finding that people are responding positively to us when we talk about our own cultural experiences, we started gaining a lot of confidence in being ourselves. And at some point, while I was writing for the site, it did occur to me that, hey, maybe if they knew that I was Indian, that maybe my voice wouldn't be as valued. Nobody told me that. That's where imposter syndrome comes in, right? It's not like anybody stands up and goes like, you don't belong here. We don't want your kind.
Well, sometimes they do.
Right. But in my case, it was just something that started accruing because there was everybody was using usernames. There must be a reason, right? People must not be welcoming. It wasn't that. It was just a general norm. And you start questioning your own space as your voice starts getting recognized more. You become a bit afraid that, hey, they like me now because I'm saying these really nice things about these dramas. But what if I start critiquing this certain aspect of it that I don't like because of my personal experiences that tells me that this is not right? Will they still like me? Will I still have a space here? What if they start hating me? So that's where imposter syndrome creeps in. And that was not a huge part of my mental makeup, but it was certainly influencing how much, very subtly, how much I was allowing myself to say something on that platform, because you don't want to start a flame war on somebody else's site. It's discourteous, right? You're in somebody else's home. You don't want to say or do something that you have decided in your own head that maybe you're not allowed to do, because around you see people not doing it. Anisa,
I want to pick up. I want to pick up on something that you said, which I feel like is really important. And we didn't actually talk about this when we were preparing, but I think that element of trust is really important. And like what you were saying about building up your own credibility with the readers, which is what we all did as writers, and then over time, sort of building a space, where the three of us, we got to know each other, we got to trust each other. There's an element of trust that you get over time with your listeners. And I think that trust that we built up as writers kind of, it allowed us to move to a different platform and for some people to actually follow us there. And that's really important to have a space where you can really feel comfortable to say what you want to say. That trust that we have between ourselves, the trust that I think, we're blessed to have from our listeners that actually like come back and listen to us, and they have actually trusted us with, like we did a representation, like a 2-episode representation special like last month or a couple months ago, and some of our listeners sent us really personal stories about their experiences with race and the Kdrama fandom and things that they experienced when they watched certain things on screen and about their own lives. That was like really an honor and a privilege. And they shared that with us because we made ourselves vulnerable. And the only reason that we were able to do that is because we trusted each other and we created that, safe space on the podcast. And that is something, when you have control of your own platform, then you have control of, like what you're willing to accept and what you're willing to have go on in that space and on that platform.
And getting that kind of feedback, which makes you feel like your work is really meaningful.
Yes.
Like, it's not just empty entertainment. It's not just a moment that people share with you. It's something that actually has deep personal meaning to them, which makes it have more personal meaning for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not like we haven't had these discussions. Like, while we've been doing this podcast for 3 years now, we just celebrated our 3rd anniversary on September 12th.
With a live stream, our very first.
We did with a live stream, with our very first one. And no, but like people had seen my faces because of small clips that are uploaded before, but I don't think most of our listeners had ever seen Anisa Saya before. So it was great. It was a milestone for us. We have had conversations over the last 3 years about, hey, it's usually pertaining to a drama or something that's happening in the Korean drama industry, like in the background. And should we comment on this? Is this okay? Do our listeners need to hear this? Or we have, also discussed the flip side of it. Like, this thing is like super salacious. Everybody's talking about it. Do we need to discuss it? Is this something that, matches our ethos? And the thing is, it's one thing to discuss this stuff with friends whose values you're already familiar with. It's another thing to go to your editor every time and be like, is it okay for us to talk about this? And because that's your struggle, your perspective, and you don't want to take somebody's permission because you feel like you don't want to disturb the balance in their space. So with the 3 of us, we know each other's values pretty well. I understand the limitations. Like, all of us understand that we have boundaries that we don't cross. And we've learned those boundaries over the last 3 years with many discussions between each other. But we feel comfortable anyway. I can bring up stuff that I might know that Saya and Anisa are not comfortable with, but with the entire knowledge that they will absolutely hear me out. They will, really consider it seriously before turning it down for good reasons. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. So it's a really comfortable, safe space. I think we've used the word safe a lot, but
it's really important, right?
Yes.
And before we move on, I just wanted to make a really quick comment on that, which is that I think if we had not paved the way in our podcast where we first talked about being Asian, and then Anisa and I talked about being Muslim, and then after that you talk about being a hijab-wearing woman, these things are aspects of our daily life that are so embedded, and like the politics of it are so embedded that, to be in a space where for once you don't have to present as a Muslim woman, you can just be a voice, right? That makes a big difference. But at the same time, you lose something. So, like, for me, and I'm extremely camera shy, and I have never put my face on the internet before. It's like the second time for me. To sit in front of a camera as a Muslim woman and bring all of that politics with me, I don't have a choice about that. That's sort of, it's just a thing that is always there. But to be able to bring that in a really positive way and be able to take control of that narrative, I think it's made a big difference to how we're able to approach podcasting in general.
Absolutely. Should we talk about the more technical aspects?
Now you're a podcaster.
Yes.
So we've made it. We're podcasters. But
But
Well,
we
we
had never
started
done
out-
anything to do with podcasting before. So,
It was
Paroma, you want
very
to
on
talk a
the
little bit
job.
about that?
Right. So when we started off, I was really new to the idea. I was just exploring the idea of editing, and I wanted to start a podcast. I just didn't want to do it alone. And more importantly, I didn't think I had an idea because we used to discuss, dramas so well behind the scenes through emails and just like personal conversations that I really wanted to do something with friends. So I think I pretty much tricked Saya into recording this one conversation we had, telling her that, hey, just for posterity, just for us, we'll re-listen to this. This will be great. And then I think I took about a month figuring out how to edit it and stuff, and then I published it. And that was like the first limitation that we tested. Are we comfortable with having our voices out there? Because of course it was a long, rambly, really badly edited episode. And also, that's important. See, we didn't just have the normal hesitations of podcasters where you're like, does anybody care about our opinion? We were obnoxiously self-confident in that we thought our opinions were relevant. And of course, people will care about it. We just have to find those people. So that wasn't our issue so much as, it was the minor stuff. Like Saya, for instance, wasn't very comfortable with her voice. I think it took her a while. It still takes her some time. I ramble a lot whenever I'm trying to make a point, and talking through certain ideas. Usually, I explain something and then I re-say it, and then well, my cats are just. I'm sorry.
I've been watching
So
them for a
distracted
while.
right now.
Yeah, that's just like a side entertainment for you. So I just, I usually tend to have like several takes in that I'm thinking through a process and then I am explaining my side of it. So when I'm editing, I tend to take out the first sections of what I said, but I hated how much I said there was just so many things that we disliked about the way we spoke. And then we had Anisa, who came, I think she joined us when we were recording our second episode, which is several months later, because that's what happens when you're a beginner with podcasting, but you haven't really thought anything through yet. Like, I work as a podcast editor now professionally. And when I launch a podcast for my clients, I have them record like 5 episodes and then it's all edited and ready before they launch. It's super professional now. But 3 years ago, when we were just winging it, when we thought maybe one episode was all we were ever going to do, we were just taking our sweet time. I think it was like 3 months later that we came up with our second episode that has Anisa in it. And by the way, Anisa is the best spoken of the 3 of us. Saya has probably the deepest, takes on things. I have the rambliest, and Anisa's like the most succinct and the best spoken. So that's just how our characters go. But it took us a while to figure out a way that the 3 of us and our 3 distinct styles could still create a cohesive episode. And this was, I think the first year was just trial and error for us. We tried different types of formats. What could work? Could we do reviews? Could we do like interviews? What would be interesting, not just for our audience, which, that's of course, but that was like 30% of what we were thinking of.
And we wanted to do everything, right?
Yes.
We were like,
Yeah,
we had so many ideas and we wanted to execute all of them. But
You
what
two
happened
had
over
so many
time-
ideas, and I was like, just wait, like, let's pick one thing, do it well.
Yeah,
Even now.
Anisa is the organizing mind of the podcast, which is how
she
we
keeps
ended
us
up.
consistent.
Yeah, and you make things happen. So, like, what happened is that we did, like, if you go back to our early episode, you can see that they're a little bit all over the place. It's like, what's your concept? And what that time gave us, that 3 to 6 months, is we did try a variety of things. And as we tried them, we found our rhythm, and we sort of began to get some feedback as well. And we began to understand what it was that like people were interested in, what were they willing to listen to through to the end, what were they going to dip in and out of. And we sort of rolled out one type of format, and we're like, oh, actually, this was pretty good. Let's make this a regular thing. And then we're like, can we do this monthly? We tried. And as that got, and people were like, this isn't enough, we want more. And then we found that there was more stuff that we wanted to talk about, things we wanted to comment on. So that required a different type of episode. So then we tried another format. And then you're on 2 episodes a month, and all of us have full-time jobs or full-time student. And it was finding the time to do all of that was so difficult. But
not to mention scheduling a recording session, because there's
between 3 different times.
Yeah, I'm in Eastern time, and Paroma is in Indian time, and Saya is in UK time. So yeah, it's been a challenge even just to schedule time. But it also helped us to find our voices, because it took us a while to get into the groove of actually listening to your own voice, which is like such a torturous thing in the beginning, where you're just like, oh my God, do I really sound like that? Is that
what I sound like?
Yes. And then, just like learning how to plan episodes in a way where you're not, rambling for 10 minutes to get to your point, or, like kind of figuring out how to say things in a way that is easier to edit, for example, which is like something that we're still learning to do even now. We're like, pause and say your point again in a way that doesn't break the continuity of the mistake you made.
Really began to appreciate once I started editing.
Yes.
All of that time when you'd casually say to Paroma, oh, cut this part out. Oh, can you do that? And you didn't realize how much work went into making that seamless and, coherent. And so now, when we say things, I think we're all of us very, very aware of how are we going to edit that.
Yeah. That's another great thing about podcasting with these two. When we started off, it was a lot. We were really inconsistent. Our episodes would get released really late, primarily because even if we did find the time to record it, it would take me ages to edit them. They tend to be, our recordings, especially at least till about a year ago, used to be 2-3 hours long that I had to pare down to maybe 1 hour 30 minutes, 1 hour 40 minutes. So this would take me an enormous amount of time, and I was working full time. I used to be a copywriter, then I transitioned to podcast editing as I realized that I really love doing this. And then of course my own podcast would suffer. However, podcasters often tend to get very intimidated by the idea of consistency. And if they can't, get an episode out on time, they feel like they've failed. They aren't getting enough listeners. We just got 100 downloads on this episode. It's not worth it anymore. We'll just give up. We worked with very few listeners, even though we were embedded in the fandom and we had consistent listeners from the fandom. We had very few listeners in the first year and a half of our podcasting. Because we were, for one, really inconsistent, yes. For another, all over the place, really rambly. So we weren't the best listening experience. Not to mention that we were all working with I didn't have this microphone till about a couple of months back. Yeah, we didn't spend anything on the podcast that the podcast didn't earn by itself. And that's an important way, thing to focus on when you're podcasting. Depends on your personality, of course. The way we started, this was always going to be a project that we put a lot of heart into in building the content. But we also didn't want it to be a sinkhole where we just put money in and then we felt like we were obligated to do things and then it became unpleasant. We just agreed between the three of us that we're going to keep doing this while it's fun. And if it's not fun for us anymore, we won't do it. And one of the primary ways we kept it fun is by making sure that our schedules weren't interrupted. If I had something massive going on in the next month, we just won't release an episode. And over time, we found that our listeners were okay with it. They wanted us to produce episodes that were good, that we were happy with. And they were, especially after we started, okay, so we should talk a bit about how we continued this stuff, even though we didn't put a lot of money in. And that was primarily because a year and a half in, we started a Patreon account. And we had no idea if we would be able to get anything out of that. We were like spending a little out of our own pocket. We had to host and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
But we were kind of hoping that the podcast takes care of itself. And at this point, it absolutely does. The podcast takes care of itself. The podcast pays for our website, for our hosting service, for editing software. So but that took time. And it wasn't that we were super consistent with everything that we were producing. It's not like we had a huge listener base. We didn't. We just slowly and steadily kept growing, because every month or so we would, or maybe every 2 months we would have an episode out, and it would be a good episode because we took our time with it and our hearts went into it. And then in the last year and a half, I think we actually started getting consistent and our listenership actually started going up. We started charting.
Yeah.
That goes the
in
hard
different
mind.
countries.
Yeah, and I'm sure it helps
just-
it now. Yeah, Saya and I also learned how to edit, although we're still far behind the master. But like we've taken some of that huge time-sucking thing out of off of Paroma's shoulders, so it's easier to get out 2 episodes a month or 3 episodes a month. We've fallen into a rhythm in terms of like the types of episodes. We have a process. We've streamlined a lot of things. We're a lot more organized now, so that has really all helped. We need to start wrapping up, but we wanted to talk about how we learned to work with each other, because we were friends first, and then we started working together after that. I mean, I don't really think of it as work, but I get, it's a kind of work.
Probably what makes it work, right?
Yeah, and I hadn't actually known these two very long before they were like, hey, we're starting a podcast. Do you want to join us? And I was like, I've only been waiting my whole life for somebody to ask me that. Yes. So it could have gone wrong. I mean, we didn't know each other. These two know each other for a long time and very well, but we just kind of instantly hit it off. At this point, I feel like I've known them my whole life, even though like we've never actually met in person. For the first,
you mean this isn't in person?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, this is it. All the in person we're getting now. But we didn't actually start recording over video until like April of this year. If you can imagine, we used to do it all over voice. But I think one of the things that's really helped is, like Paroma was saying earlier, we have very open lines of communication. We have made a conscious effort to be very honest with each other. Sometimes we have to have uncomfortable conversations, but we have them, and we always have them with respect and love, and like understanding where the other person is coming from. We all have different cultural backgrounds. We all, the countries we live in are very different. We've grown up in different cultures. We have different personalities. But we've sort of learned what each of our personality brings to the table and how we can use each person's strengths in the best way and like complement each other. And that has made it a really good experience, so that we all have things that we're good at. And we also have things that we're like, hey, I'm not actually that good at this. Can you help me out? Can you take this one on? I'll do the other thing. Like we feel able to ask each other for that. And so I think that's really made it a lot easier to work together, and it's made this like sustainable long term.
Yeah, that's true. And also
like
we
that is
each
so
have our own
perfectly.
strengths, so that we recognize that we each have our own strengths. We understood what each of us brings into this thing, and it's equally valuable. And I don't think I could have started a podcast with anyone else and actually continued it for this long. It's important who you start a project like this with. It's not just a matter of, recording your voice, editing it, putting it out into the world. You can do that, of course, but you get tired of how when you're doing this for a long time, it's tiring. And you want to have friends around you who can sort of like shoulder the burden with you, and also be equally frustrated with the process, but
and you can have days where you can say like, this month is just a really bad month for me. Please let me have some time off this month. And the other two are like, yes, we can do that. And then we just take turns like that, and it really, really helps.
It does. And now we are building a blog around our podcast. It's like an offshoot. It's a little baby. And every month that it's jumping up in viewership, we are getting more and more excited. And we know that we have this new thing that we are creating only because we had our podcast first. We built the audience there, and now we are slowly transitioning it to the blog as well.
Yes.
And before we finish, one last minute to say, you guys, what's your favorite thing about this journey, and what are you most grateful for? You get 30
guys.
seconds each.
Oh, you stole my answer. I think
You
That was a
guys
good
are
answer.
just, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Paroma.
You guys are just
That was the
space
entirety of
free.
her answer, wasn't it?
Yeah, actually it was. But just to add to that, you guys are the space that we created where I can confidently be myself and not have to question, whether I can be here. So, thank you for that.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I've learned how to do so many things that I don't think that I would have tried doing. So thanks, Paroma, for tweaking us into doing this.
Right, I feel like I became a journalist.
Something happened. We did so many things that I never imagined that we would do. So, this was Paroma's idea. She was like, "Hey, let's do this panel for International Podcast Day," and we were like, can we do that?" She was like, "Yes, we can do it. You can do it." So, here we are.
We did it.
We did it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dave.
Yes, thank
Absolutely.
you.
Well, ladies, this has been an absolute pleasure to take a part in. I got a lot of laughs. I enjoyed seeing the cats jump around in the background and added a little flavor to it. Your voices are amazing. I love that you organized this panel. I think what you presented was amazing. I can't wait to share it with our community beyond just International Podcast Day. So, Paroma, Anisa, Saya, thank you so much for taking part in International Podcast Day 2020. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you,
Thank you
us.
so
Dave.
much for having us. Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Such a
everybody,
pleasure.
don't forget to continue to tune in. Head over to internationalpodcastday.com and continue to use that hashtag International Podcast Day.